Hello and welcome to the Birth Words Podcast, Episode 5, Genesis. Today I'll be telling the story of my second birth experience.
You're listening to the Birth Words Podcast. Utah-based birth doula and applied linguistics scholar Sarah Pixton digs into the language of pregnancy and birth to help expectant women claim their power as life-giving agents engaged in a praiseworthy work. This podcast aims to promote positive birth paradigms and is not intended as medical advice.
Welcome! I'm looking forward to sharing my story with you on this episode. I've named it Genesis because it is telling the beginning of a lot of things. Most obviously, it tells the story of the beginning of my son's life, but it also, through that experience, tells the beginning of my journey in becoming a birth worker and coming to this point where I am today. So, here we go. As I prepared for my son's birth, I knew that I wanted my experience with birth to be very different from my previous birth experience. If you listened to episode 3, you know what I'm talking about. My first pregnancy was a twin pregnancy, and my sweet twin daughters were born at 35 weeks via emergency cesarean section. And go back and listen to that episode if you want more details. But going into, from the moment I knew I was pregnant, from before the time that I knew I was pregnant, I knew that I wanted a different experience. And I knew that a VBAC was a very real possibility for me. My care provider from the obstetrician from the twins' birth even said from my 6-week appointment that I'd be a good candidate for a VBAC. The C-section was due to decreased fetal heart rate, and that's not something that should necessarily happen again. So that was the plan from the get-go. I was having a VBAC. And I knew that I needed to know more about my body and what was going on because, for one thing, this was going to be an unmedicated VBAC. I did not plan to use any type of anesthesia. And so I knew that I needed tools to cope with the intensity of labor if I didn't have the medical interventions that I had had previously. And I knew that I wanted to walk away from the experience feeling differently about it. Feeling not that it was a medical emergency, but that it was something that my body did. So I introduced myself through my childbirth education course and books that I read and discussions that I had to the discourse of physiological woman-centered birth. And if you want to know what I mean by the term discourse, go back and listen to episode 4, where I break down what that term means. But basically, I just knew I needed to be in a different paradigm, a different perspective for this birth. So I surrounded myself with positive birth narratives, and I invited myself to be part of that narrative. I inducted myself into that genre of storytelling, positive birth narratives. So I found them online. I found a ton of them in Ina May Gaskin's Ina May's Guide to Childbirth. That's what it's called. Lots of great stories there about these women who just found their power as birth-giving women who had the strength and the ability to bring forth life, and that was life-changing. I read the book, The Gift of Giving Life, Rediscovering the Divine Nature of Pregnancy and Childbirth. And from my faith perspective, that was huge to think about the spiritual work that I was doing. And that really helped me to put myself in that subject position, in the agent position, that I was the one giving birth. I was preparing for birth, and my husband was an integral part of that. During our childbirth education courses, as I would practice different relaxation techniques, he was there recognizing that this was a family affair, and this was a physiological affair, and this was something that my body could do. And so I was ready. Most mornings, I think, I would meditate, which was not a practice that I was familiar with, and it was not something I ever got that good at. And I would also do some visualizations to visualize natural processes that acted as metaphors for birth. And I think aligning birth with these natural metaphors helped me recognize that it is a natural process. And it was something that my body is naturally designed to do. So as I tuned in to my body through these experiences, I allowed my body to do what it was naturally designed to do. So then the morning came where I woke up at 4:30 to a strong contraction and a little pop, and my water had broken, and I was right on my due date or 2 days past, depending on who you ask. I was uncomfortable and I was ready to have this baby. And I was so excited when my water broke. I had been having contractions really for months, in just like they'd come every 10 minutes for a couple of hours, every couple of days. And my cervix was beginning to dilate or open. And it was slowly starting to come together. So I called my care provider and let my obstetrician know that my water had broken. I spoke with her and she suggested coming into the hospital and confirming if that was the case. She also knew that at my previous appointment, I had been already dilating, suspected that things might go fairly quickly, and as I was group B strep positive, it would be beneficial for me to have some rounds of penicillin going. So I went in and did that, and well, it didn't happen that simply. So we started driving to the hospital, and I think there was about a 20-minute lapse in contractions, maybe 30, between that one that I felt right as my water was breaking. And then as we were driving to the hospital, they started getting strong, quite strong, and they're uncomfortable in a car. It was about a 15-minute drive, and I had 2 or 3 in the drive over and a couple more as I walked from where we parked into the birth. I think they call it a birthing center wing of the hospital where I was giving birth in Massachusetts. And I went to the desk, told them I was in labor. They took me into the triage room, the initial room, and I consented to a cervical exam, and I was 8.5 centimeters dilated, and contractions were getting more intense all the time, and they wanted to do a strip of monitoring upon admission to the hospital to check baby's heart rate, make sure everything was looking good. So I had to... Oh, and at the same time, they were placing my IV, which they had trouble finding the veins. So anyway, among all of these things, I was stuck in bed for a while during transition, and it was so uncomfortable. But also I have positive memories of some of it. Not of the contraction that just reeled me from one side to the other and saying, I can't do this, which is the international code for I'm in transition. Right as the nurse was checking the dilation of my cervix, right afterwards, she looked at me and said, "You are misleading." So I took that as a high compliment that I was doing well with trusting my body to do what it needed to do and working with it instead of against it. And when they had finished placing my IV for the penicillin for the group B strep, and gotten every paperwork and everything taken care of, I went across the hall to the room where my baby was going to be born, and they offered a wheelchair, and I walked and took a while finding some positions, trying to find some comfort, knelt by the side of the bed, knelt on the birthing ball, was really just not too comfortable because I was rapidly going through the birth process. And I ended up passing out for a few moments because I have just historically really low blood pressure combined with the intensity of labor. This is very uncommon. I've never talked to anybody else that that's happened to. I admit they got me on the bed after that and gave me some oxygen, and I felt like that was the right choice at that point. And pretty soon I was ready to push, and I was back to my conscious state and felt comfortable without the oxygen, and pushed for 45 minutes. And then I had a beautiful and perfect 9-pound, 6-ounce baby boy. And there were a lot of things about this experience that could be viewed as a medical emergency. I was a trial of labor after cesarean, as it is called from the medical discourse. So there are certain risks, or as we learned before, responsibilities inherent with that title. I was taking heparin, giving myself heparin injections every 12 hours at this point because I have a blood clotting disorder, and being pregnant heightens the risk of developing blood clots, which I had learned previously and didn't want to relearn. So I had that medication that I was working with, and I had group B strep, which I needed the IV for. With my loss of consciousness, being administered oxygen, I ended up with a severe tear as well. There were lots of things that I could have said, wow, this birth was also a medical emergency, and that's what I wanted to get away from. And here I am again in a medical emergency. But that was not what I walked away from the experience with. I walked away from the birth of my son with a sense of wonder at my body and the amazing work it did to bring life, and that it was designed, it was made to do this. And when people asked, how was your birth? I just couldn't use other words than just amazing and incredible. And I got some weird looks, but it was phenomenal and empowering, as I realized the work that my body could do. And yes, it was intense, but I was just as strong as the work that was going on within my body. I was not separate from my body. My body was doing this work, and I was part of it. And we brought my son into the world. And it set me on this journey to be a doula, to support other women along this path as birth-giving agents, and to offer a path to an emotionally empowering experience in which they're supported in all aspects, not only medically, which the care providers do an excellent job taking care of, but also physically, because birth, if you haven't done it, it's very physical and requires some physical support and emotional support as well. I wanted to make sure these women are emotionally supported, because as physical as birth is, it's equally emotional. And I want to support women spiritually in whatever way they respond to that, at least in the sense of life bringing forth new life, as Ina May Gaskin says, and beyond that when clients are so inclined. So I am so glad to share with you this story of Genesis, of the birth of my son, of the birth of my career as a doula. And I look back on the experience of the birth of my twins with just such gratitude for everything turning out the way that it did, even though there were so many bumps, things that could have gone wrong. There were so many things that I learned from that experience, and that I keep learning from them all the time. every day, and I love them all. And I'm so glad to be on this journey with all of you. And I hope that you will tune in next week as we keep talking about linguistics and birth. See you next Monday.
Did words play an important role in your birth experience? If you're interested in sharing your story on the podcast, go to summitbirthutah.com/birthwords. If you're liking what you hear on the podcast, please leave a review on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or wherever you choose to listen. For more resources about harnessing the power of words to benefit the birth experience, visit summitbirthutah.com/birthwords.